I am Guhyeon Jeong, a researcher of the SSK Research Cluster at GNU. Today, Professor Marcello Musto will give a presentation on the topic War and the Left, Considerations on a Checkered History. Thank you for your accepting our invitation, Professor Musto. It is a great pleasure to hear from you. Let me introduce Professor Musto briefly. Marcello Musto is a professor of sociological theory at York University in Toronto and is known globally for his studies on Karl Marx and Marxism. His publications include 4 single-authored books, 11 edited volumes, and 50 journal articles and book chapters. His work has been translated worldwide in 25 languages, and his writings have appeared in dozens of different publications from many disciplines. 2 of his books have been translated and published in Korea. Ripensare 마르크스의 마르크시즘이 스튜디에 쌓았지. 마르크스와 마르크스주의들을 다시 생각한다. From Hanul in 2013, and the last years of Karl Marx, 1881 to 1883, an intellectual biography. 마르크스의 마지막 투쟁, 1881년에서 83년의 지적 여정, from 산진이 in 2018, and a new book he edited will be published at the end of this month. The Marx Revival, Key Concepts and New Interpretation. 마르크스의 부활, 핵심 개념과 새로운 해석, from 하늘. Over the years, Professor Musto has presented his ideas at over 130 academic events in more than 20 countries and has built an international intellectual network for research, partnership, and public engagement. He is the founding director of the Laboratory for Alternative Theories at York University and the editor of the book series Marx Engels Marxisms from Palgrave Macmillan and Critique and Alternatives to Capitalism from Routledge. Professor Musto also contributes regularly to the several daily and online newspapers. His writings focus on socialism, progressive social movements, and left-wing political parties. Professor Musto, you have 1 hour for presentation, and it will be followed by 30 minutes of floor discussion. Professor Musto, please start your talk.
Thank you very much for this generous introduction presentation. And I also wanted to congratulate with you, among other things, for the perfect Italian that you use. Wonderful. It's rare to have this. And as you know, it is always a pleasure to work with you, with your unit, and to return to Korea. Today only online, but hopefully very, very soon, in a few months, also in person, when there will be book launches and talks about the Marx Revival. I've seen that a copy is already available, and I'm very thrilled and excited, as always, to wait a few more weeks for the official launch of the book. But today, I'm not talking about Karl Marx, or that is, you know, the topic that I usually present at our meetings and invitation that you repeatedly offer me. Today, I'm going to talk about war, because we decided that it would have been a timely topic, and also not changing the approach that I usually have in some of my studies, which is trying to go back to history, in this case, not only to the history of Marxism, but to a broader history of labor movement, including anarchism, feminism, and all different components of socialism, including social democracy and more reformist currents of the labor movements, in order to see how these thinkers, and most importantly, how this political organization that were so influential in the past responded to the question of war. And this is particularly interesting and useful for me nowadays, when there is so much need of historical understanding, and there is lack of knowledge of the history in general, and of labor movement communism in particular. So I want to go back to history, because I want to see how other thinkers and political parties, social movements of the left responded to things that are very urgent and compelling for us today, like the question of how to respond if there is a war of defense, whether or not a war can be considered a just war, that are things, of course, that you are discussing also in South Korea, in Asia. But as you can imagine, the topic is at the center of political, ethical, and of course also economical debates and preoccupation in Europe. So I will start by saying, after this introduction, that while political science had offered ideological, political, economic, sometimes also psychological motivations for what are the causes that drive human beings to wars, I mentioned, not by accident, the psychological dimension, because, you know, sometimes war have been in the past, centuries ago, been explained like, you know, there was a particular decision of that individual, a monarch, the ambition of a king. What is, in my opinion, the most compelling contribution of socialism, of labor movement, to the explanation of wars, to the explanation of the reasons of wars, is the connection with the economic dimension, and particularly the fact that capitalism is creating, according to some statements of the past, inevitably wars, right? So this is the first point that I want to make, the fact that wars are inevitable under the regime of capitalist production. And this is also connected, of course, as you will see in many of my reflections, with the topic of your research center and research project about alternatives, about innovation, about rethinking the past and the mistakes of the left in order to provide new perspectives. So if this is the first theoretical point that the labor movement is providing, I would like to tell you where I found important roots for this. I found them in the International Working Men Association, that is usually called with the name First International. The First International was an organization established in 1864. Marx had a significant role in this organization. And in 1868, at a congress that was held in Brussels, in Belgium, one noted delegate, his name was César de Pape, put together, you know, he had presented his thesis, an interesting speech, and put forward the thesis of the importance for labor movements to pursue the final abolition of all wars. And if you read the documents of this period, you will see that all wars should be considered like civil wars by labor movement. I found this very fascinating and very remarkable. I always dislike the idea that if there is a conflict within a country, between a part of Korea and another, is called civil war. But then when there is a conflict between a country and another country, it's called war, right? Like if humans are different according to their nationality. The idea of labor movement that I will try to explain in detail during the next 50 minutes, 10 are already gone, is the fact that all workers are the same. All workers should be considered like human beings, like citizens, and there should be solidarity among them, and therefore a strong objection to war. All wars should be considered civil wars, and the labor movement should work for the final abolition of all wars, which means the abolition of capitalism, because, as I just told you, they believe that capitalism creates inevitably wars under its regime of production and competition among countries. Now, many of you, and then the final point that I want to make, I will return to this later, but I better mention this now, is the idea that there must be a strike. There must be a general strike. In case there is a war, what workers should be doing? The idea is that workers should call a general strike. So now the strike is called not only for economic reasons, but also for political reasons. And this is very interesting and remarkable, with some objections to this, including the skepticism of Karl Marx. You may ask now, what is the position of Marx on war? And my response is that Marx never wrote, and I will also say, of course, a systematic text on war. Let me start from of course. Why I said of course? Because Marx was a human being who was not able to cover and to write about all subjects. And because Marx was focused on the economical analysis of capitalism, right? He's writing the critique of capitalism. So he was not able to cover all these aspects of politics and social life. But it's true that Marx also wrote about war in some moment, particularly in some journalistic pieces. And the position that Marx had was never like indicating to the labor movement what is the position of the Communist Party on that the socialist movement should have on war. So there is not one a priori position that should be applied everywhere, which is actually the approach of Marx to many things, because he didn't want to suggest the idea that there is a theorist who was telling us what to do and the recipes about what to do in every part of the world or in every historical period. So Marx is writing about war, and this is a little bit fun. He's taking always positions against Russia. If you look at the text written by Marx, he is always against Russia in this geopolitical, or what we call today international relations dimensions. Why? Because Marx believed that Russia was, and actually Russia really was, indeed was, a counter-revolutionary force that was going to intervene in Europe every time there was an upheaval, a riot, a possibility of revolution. So defeating Russia or diminishing the power of Russia was a guarantee for the labor movement to have a victorious revolution, or to have more chances to move forward toward emancipation. And it is funny that these writings of Marx were never published in Soviet Union, even though these were not manuscript, but writings that Marx wrote himself, because in Soviet Union, they were scared about people associating the critique that Marx made to Russia with the critique that many people were doing in the 20th century about the interventions of Soviet Union in the so-called socialist bloc. But I will return to this point later. So if Marx didn't really write significant things on war, the person who took more attention on this topic was his comrade and life friend Friedrich Engels, who wrote about this topic several times. And today I would like to call your attention on one point. There is a series of articles that were published in a pamphlet in 1893 called "Can Europe Disarm?" That's interesting. Engels, at the end of his life, 2 days before dying, while he was still working on editing volume 3 of Capital, is thinking that this topic is very urgent and it is absolutely necessary for labor movement to know what to do with respect to war. And Engels is writing that there is a level in Europe. The title is "Can Europe Disarm?" An unprecedented level of arms production and war preparation. Imagine, this is 1893. Imagine if Engels had lived more to see what happened later for World War I, for example, that he wrote there might be soon the possibility of, I'm citing, a war of destruction such as the world has never seen. So Engels is extremely worried about the situation and is writing that the systems of standing army has been carried to such extreme throughout Europe that it must either bring economic ruin to people on account of the military burden or else degenerate into a general war of extermination. So Engels says, either the states are spending so much money for war, for arms race, that there will be always less money for what we call today social welfare, or at some point there will be an explosion of a war, and this conflict will significantly destroy Europe and will create the death and desperation, injuries, dramas for hundreds of thousands of European citizens. So the idea of Engels is that there should be a reduction in terms of arms race, a very strong reduction in terms of military service. There should not be a professional army, which is seen as something very aggressive by Engels, and we should move forward a sort of, disarmament that in the end will guarantee peace. Engels is almost ending his life with this contribution and preoccupation about war. Now, there is another significant element, there is another significant event that is happening while Marx and Engels were alive. And you know very well, I'm talking about the Paris Commune, 1871. But those of you who are familiar with European history of the 19th century knows that before the Paris Commune, there was a war between France and Germany when, their Kaiser was still there, Bismarck. So two leaders of the German social democracy, very radical, both of them, and not close to Lassalle, but close to Marx. I'm talking about Wilhelm Liebknecht and August Bebel. They did something for the first time very interesting. They rejected the bill for additional funding to expand the war, to go on war, and they voted against the possibility, what it is called, it's very famous, this expression, war credit. So the government is actually trying to move forward the bill to spend more money for war, and these two members of parliament, Bebel and Liebknecht, voted against. What happened was that they went to jail. They were sentenced for high treason, but they demonstrated to the labor movement that there was an alternative way of dealing with war, which is not supporting the governments who wanted to spend more money, declare war, etc. This is interesting for me because this example of a concrete event, and how the left responded to a concrete event, is becoming not occasional, but something structural, something repetitive, because there are many wars between this period and 1914. Many wars, I mean that there are European countries that are starting to create a very aggressive, to promote a very aggressive imperial policy. The first of them is Germany with the so-called Weltpolitik. And therefore, from now on, for the labor movement, war and what to do in case of war is not only a theoretical question, is not only an abstract, philosophical, ethical issue, but is a concrete problem that they should face. And the question of what to do in front of war determined also the fact that war became important for labor movement. For example, if you read the resolution of the Second International, this new association that was created, this one in 1889, and actually this Second International imploded, was destroyed by the split because of war in 1914. So it is actually war that determined the end of the Second International. Well, if you read the resolution, you see that there is an important position, relevance that was played to war, because they said the indispensable precondition of any emancipation of workers is peace, right? So you see that there is a growing part of the labor movement that is paying attention to war. And there is a growing part of the labor movement, and this is a change compared to the past. And I would like to open a parenthesis here and go back to French Revolution, a growing part that is no longer looking at wars as an opportunity for revolution. Because in the past, there were people who believed that thanks to war, it is possible to move forward in a faster way toward the revolution, not only in the past, but also in the future, as I will tell you very soon with regard to Lenin. Where is this idea coming from? This idea is coming from the Iranian and Revolutionary War of 1792. And there is the idea of a crusade for liberty. There is something that might reminds you, Bush and the United States and this idea of exporting democracy. But actually at the time, there was an idea that came after the French Revolution to liberate the rest of Europe and to do revolutionary wars in order to liberate other working class of other countries from the capitalist oppressor. And there is this famous quotation, liberty is brought by bayonets, which is a position to which Maximilien Robespierre opposed. That's very interesting. If you want to be faithful with history, we must talk about this paradox in French history that a person like Napoleon, who was responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths, he is considered as one of the preeminent French citizens, and Napoleon, and Robespierre, who actually opposed to this, has been associated with terror and things like this, while on the contrary, his position was very clear. So if we try to move a little bit faster and see what happened to the Second International, in 1907, there was an important congress that took place in Germany, in the city of Stuttgart. And in this congress, there was a revolution, a significant one, on militarism and international conflict. And the Second International was supporting three requests, 3 points. The first is that representatives of the labor movement should vote against budgets that increase military spending. The second one is that they are opposing to standing armies. I told you, professional army, and they are in favor of a system of people militias, which means that young people, coming from ordinary, proletarian families, etc., they spend 1 year, 2 years in the army, and there is a rotation. There is not a professional army. And then there is also this idea that was opposed by some of the most radical members of the Second International, but in any case, the idea of, because it was seen as an idea too much liberal and bourgeois, the idea of creating some sort of courts of arbitration, right? And this courts of arbitration should have settled down international conflict, but peacefully. So there is a problem between Japan and South Korea. Instead of creating a war and conflict, you go to this course of arbitration and you must find a solution peacefully. This was the last document of the Second International that was voted unanimously, because after this, there are 2 trends in the international. One trend that is very strong in the German Social Democratic Party, and not only there, is to support more and more and more their national governments, and in the end, to vote in favor of this war credits, to spend more money, to approve, to be part, to be co-responsible to war. And this will be the disastrous position that the majority of socialist and social democratic parties took before the explosion, the eruption of the Great War, which is what we call today World War I. It was called the Great War that started in 1914. And then there is another current in the labor movement that was minoritarian at the beginning that opposed to this decision. And I will mention soon who are the most important representative of this current. But for the moment, I would like to call your attention on one remarkable book that was written by the most important French socialist leader of the time, Jean Jaurès. The book was published in 1911. The title of the book is The New Army. And in this book, it is interesting because we can try to understand what to do in case of defensive war. What are the distinctions between offensive and defensive war? And what is the attitude that the labor movement should have in front of them? So according to Jaurès, it is legitimate for European countries to respond to war, and they should be prepared to war in case there is an aggression. A person who was strongly opposed, was very critical, let me say like this, very critical of this position was Rosa Luxemburg. Because Rosa Luxemburg wrote that if you talk about historical phenomena like modern wars, you cannot measure them with the yardstick of justice and through a paper scheme of defense and aggression. So Rosa Luxemburg was trying to say, if there is a war, it is also possible that the state who declared the war was forced by another state bigger by provocations, by movements at the borders, etc., to declare war. So the question of who is the country, what is the country that has declared war is not the central one, or sometimes cannot be the central ones, because it is difficult to establish what kind of stratagems could be adopted by different countries in terms to create an escalation and to go to war. And Rosa Luxemburg was against this idea of the army, the new army, because, you know, she said that anytime we have a war, there will be armed nation, there will be, you know, militarization in the society. There will be full to this growing nationalist ideas and military ideas. And this is something very close, very similar to what another remarkable woman of this period, she lived, you know, a little bit, she was born after Rosa Luxemburg, and she saw Nazism. And at the very beginning of the most dramatic chapter of European history of the 20th century Nazism, this woman, I'm talking about Simone Weil, she wrote a book that was called, a very short, article that was called Reflections of War. And in this article, she said, I'm citing her, this is a very wonderful quotation, no matter what name it might take, no matter if the name is fascism, democracy, or dictatorship of the proletariat, the principal enemy remains the administrative, police, and military apparatus, not the enemy across the border, who is our enemy only to the extent that they are our brothers and sisters' enemy, but the one who claims to be our defender while making us its slaves. So the preoccupation of these two revolutionaries, Rosa Luxemburg and Simone Weil, difference among them with different position, etc. But the preoccupation is that war will give more power to military apparatus, that will be a growing militarization in the society. And the left must oppose to this. Now, in this period, there are the period that started with 1914, the Great War, World War I. There are two important conferences. Both of them took place in Switzerland, the first in 1915 in Zimmerwald, the second in 1916 in Kintal. They are very nice, they are very important, and I recommend to the young students I see, and I know some of you, to return to these documents and to read very carefully these statements, because they are always very inspiring. And always very inspiring are also two personalities and two political leaders of this epoch. One is the already mentioned Rosa Luxemburg, and the other one is Lenin, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Both of them were strongly opposing war, and they did it in particularly interesting ways. First, Rosa Luxemburg, she said that the slogan "war on war" should become the cornerstone of working class politics. Imagine how important this is for Rosa Luxemburg. War on war should be the most important slogan, the opposition to war, the most important things for labor movement. And Rosa Luxemburg also said that the main goal of the proletariat should be fighting imperialism and preventing wars in peacetime as well as in wartime, which means that always during the peace, the workers, labor movement, socialist, social democratic, communist party, they should work to keep the peace, to maintain the peace, to prevent conflict and wars. So you understand that Rosa Luxemburg is giving a central importance to war, to peace against war, and she's strongly opposing militarism. The second person that I mentioned before, Lenin, is remarkable for the fact that he was able to disveil the historical falsification of the bourgeoisie that in this period is trying to present imperialistic powers of the times, the wars of the time as wars that were made for a progressive sense of national liberation. We are going to what we call today the global south. We liberate them. We give them democracy, economic improvement, development, etc., etc. Lenin is actually calling these wars wars of plunder. Lenin is saying that behind the claim of this bourgeois government to be defending the fatherland when there was a conflict with other imperialistic powers, lay the right that certain great powers had given themselves, and I'm quoting Lenin now, to pillage the colonies and to oppress foreign people. So Lenin believed that wars were not fought to safeguard the existence of nations, but to defend the privileges, domination, plunder, and violence of the various imperialist bourgeoisies. So Lenin said, you are doing this war just because you want to see which country between, for example, Germany and England can continue to exploit and to oppress other peoples and other countries in Africa, just to make an example, in India, etc., etc. So Lenin is calling the people within the Second International Social Democracy who are supporting this kind of war social chauvinists. They are chauvinists like all the others, but he added this adjective social, right, to demonstrate that they are part of the same trend, but they pretend to be social democratic. And according to Lenin, there are just wars, But the just wars are only the wars that are fought by oppressed people, by subjugated people and nations who had been plundered and deprived of this right, of their right, by these great imperialistic powers, great slave-owning powers. And the slogan of Lenin, perhaps the most famous slogan, even more famous than War to War of Rosa Luxemburg in labor movement, is the slogan to turn imperialistic war into civil war. So the idea that when an imperialistic government has started a war in a country against another imperialistic power in Europe, or a war of colonial attack, then the labor movement should be there, strong and ready to change, to turn this war into another war, a civil war inside the country, in order to take the government to abolish capitalism and therefore to abolish war. Because as I told you at the very beginning, capitalism creates wars in an inevitable way. Let me now pause a little bit the history of war and the debate and the conflict, and also the big fight about war within Marxist tradition. And let me go to two other traditions for which wars were similarly lines of demarcation. One of this is the Anarchist movement, and another one is the Feminist movement. So to let you understand once again, and this is why I'm doing this exercise, and this is why I wrote the papers that Left and the War was also translated into Korean and is going to appear in a few days in the new issue of Marxism 21. Why we look at the past? Because before us, other people, other parties, other social movements, they were trying to respond to similar questions. For example, the most known and respected anarchist of the time, or one of the two, three most known and respected one, Peter Kropotkin, was very worried about the aggressive, conservative and reactionary politics that Germany was having at the time. And Kropotkin wrote, the beginning of World War I, that the task of any person holding dear the idea of human progress is to squash the German invasion in Western Europe. So the idea of Kropotkin might be a little bit similar, you know, the position in which Kropotkin put himself, a little bit similar to what we are observing today with Russia, right? There is an extremely conservative state and power, and if this power is winning, the human progress, the idea of human progress, according to people who believe like Kropotkin, is going to be in even more difficult and complicated position. Why Kropotkin is talking about this? Because we know that the anarchist movement had a very strong and clear position. In case of war, workers should call for a general strike. Yes, but Kropotkin said, if we do this, only a very, very small part of labor movement, of the working class, will go on a strike. And if we do this, he said, we are indirectly helping Germany to win the war. Therefore, for Kropotkin, you know, anarchists should pause with their anti-militarism and should participate to the, let's say, coalition was trying to stop Germany and the possible victory of Germany. The majority of anarchists, on the contrary, differently from Kropotkin, guided by the Italian anarchist Enrico Malatesta, argued that, on the contrary, while it is true that Germany was such a bad power and that the German victory will certainly spell the triumph of militarism, they were arguing that also if the other coalition, a coalition that at the time was, you know, around England, etc., also if they were winning a triumph of the Allies, this other coalition will also mean another form of domination in Europe and in Asia. So it is not that the defeat of Germany and the support for the other coalition will represent a step forward emancipation. And actually they were worried that if the left, if socialists, if anarchists were merging with these people, losing their central slogan and important element of not participating to wars, not supporting wars, avoiding that there is this feeling of nationalism, chauvinism among working classes of different countries. Therefore, the slogan was not a man and not a cent for war. Another nice and important slogan at the time. Well, this would be much more important. And also they believed, I'm reading from the anti-war manifesto published in 1915, none of the belligerents has any right to lay claim to civilization, just as none of them is entitled to claim legitimate self-defense. This is another statement that made me think, when I immersed myself into this historical document of today, of the contemporary situation with Ukraine and Russia, and the fact that actually the other the side of the conflict, the allies, if we want to make a comparison with what Malatesta wrote, they cannot claim civilization, they cannot claim legitimate self-defense, because actually they did the same and they will do the same in the future. So for people like Malatesta, for the very well-known Emma Goldman, for Ferdinand Neuven, who is, he was in touch with Marx, and Marxist scholars know him, anarchists should firmly reject any support, direct or indirect, for the pursuit of war. And now I want to go to the other movement that I mentioned before, the feminist movement. And I want to discuss the fact that some leaders of the feminist movement, particularly in the liberal wings in the United Kingdom, etc., so war, consider war at the beginning, perhaps like a possibility to demonstrate, and they were right, that women can replace men in jobs, men who were sent to, borders, to the front, to fight, etc., replace, or as we know sometimes, to do much, much better the work that men were doing at the time. And the newborn suffragette movement started to have this nationalist and chauvinist component as well. So it is in this period that the political work of women communist leaders, I already mentioned Rosa Luxemburg, but there were others. There was Clara Zetkin in Germany. There was Alexandra Kollontai in Russia. There was also Sylvia Pankhurst in England. The idea that actually governments of the time should be denounced, because in evoking wars, in evoking the importance of doing wars, in evoking the enemy at the gates, as they were saying at the time, they were actually using wars to roll back fundamental social reforms, the social reforms that people, workers of the time had been waiting for a very long time. So they courageously denounced this position, and they also understood that from the opposition to militarism, there was an essential element for the struggle against patriarchy. So the opposition to war became a distinctive element of feminism, a distinctive part of the International Women's Day later. And you will see that, I will say, all feminist movement and the opposition to war budgets on the outbreaks of any conflict featured prominently in all their platforms, in all the platforms of international feminist movement. And I'll stop here on feminism. And now we'll move to the other topic. I have 15 minutes left. That is perhaps also the final one. What happened in Soviet Union and what happened after World War I with war. So I would say that starting from the 20s, in the 30s, in this very complicated age for the left and progressive forces, where they were also fighting amongst each other. Remember what happened in Germany and the fact that Rosa Luxemburg was killed when social democracy was at the government, or remember all these fights between socialist, social democratic forces against communist forces. It took a lot of time to move forward to what Trotsky had actually seen before, and correctly many other people or anybody else need to do a left front, a popular front against fascism and Nazism, since Mussolini took the power in 1922 in Italy and Hitler in 1933 in Germany. So in this period, in labor movement, there is a lot of talk about peace, and peace is declared essential in many documents and many resolutions and programs of labor parties. The question is that many people, the majority of the leaders, believed that a new 1914 was inevitable. When I say a new 1914, I say a new eruption of the war was inevitable. They believed that the new war would break out soon. And from one point of view, they were writing in favor of peace, but from another point of view, they were trying to prepare possible scenarios and forms of resistance. One of them was the Molotov von Ribbentrop pact between Russia, Soviet Union, and Germany. In this period, there is also, now labor movement spread around the world, and there are, different contexts, very different contexts. For example, if you read at Mao Zedong in this period, 1938, in the texts called On Protracted War, or for example, Problems of War and Strategy, well, Mao is using a very violent terminology. He wrote that only with guns can the whole world be transformed, and there is a sort of omnipotence of revolutionary war. So it is something very similar to what I mentioned before that happened in French Revolution 1792. Mao wrote, "The seizure of power by armed force, the settlement of the issue by war, is the central task and the highest form of revolution." Going back to Europe, there is another important event, an event that is still playing an essential role in Russian national unity. And we have seen this a few weeks ago with the discourse of Putin and the demonstration and celebration that take place every year. I'm talking about the Great Patriotic War, and in particular, the anniversary of the victory of Soviet Union on Nazi fascist front. So in this period, I would like to say that the policy of Soviet Union is very interesting to observe, because if from one point of view they moved toward this representation of peace, and the most significant element of this can be seen in the so-called peaceful coexistence, that is a new political course inaugurated by Nikita Khrushchev in 1961, the idea of avoiding escalation with the United States. And, this is something that can also be seen with the crisis in Cuba in 1962, etc. Well, we can also say that this is a policy that Soviet Union had outside and also until a certain point of view. But in what Soviet Union considered as an imperialistic power, and I'll return to this later, consider is zone of comfort, zone of protection, in particular the socialist bloc, the countries from Eastern Europe. Well, politics was very different then. Think, for example, to what happened in Hungary in 1956, or think, for example, what happened in Czechoslovakia in 1968. What was the response of the Politburo of the Communist Party of Soviet Union to the so-called Prague Spring? It was, the sending 500,000 of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and a very dramatic conflict that also changed the representation of Soviet Union and also socialism in general, I would say, make socialist movement weaker from this point of view. And this is also the beginning of the new left and many criticism of this old style party state way of dealing with conflict and contradictions. I think that the problem can be explained very interestingly with the speech that was given by the next General Secretary of the Communist Party of Soviet Union. At the time, it was Brezhnev, Leonid Brezhnev, and no longer Nikita Khrushchev. So Brezhnev said that every time that there is a conflict in a country of the socialist bloc, the problem is not only of that country, but it is of the socialist bloc in general. And therefore, it is the task of Soviet Union to decide whether this conflict is emancipatory or is reactionary, and therefore United Soviet Union can intervene. So Soviet Union continued to earmark a sizable part of its economic resources for military spending, and this, following the ideas of Rosa Luxemburg, of Simone Weil, reinforce an authoritarian culture in the society of Soviet Union. And this can also be seen with the very well-known 1979 invasion of the Red Army in Afghanistan, and more in general with the fact that a significant part of external policy, of foreign policy, of Soviet Union was treated and dealt with the Red Army. And this is another step that contributed to the idea that Soviet Union was actually an imperialistic power, just as the United States. And there is actually something that it is even more dramatic if we go back to the kind of principles of labor movement that I tried to present at the beginning. So the idea that wars are related to capitalism, it is dramatic because in 1977, 1979, there are wars between Cambodia and Vietnam and between China and Vietnam. And these are parts of the Sino-Soviet conflict. These are part of the conflict that took place between China and the Soviet Union. You know that they disagreed starting from 1956, and there were splits in the communist parties, very dramatic. Perhaps the most interesting one in Asia is what happened in India, and not only there, almost everywhere. And now there are socialist countries, there is no capitalism there, but there are wars, right? So this is actually taking a very significant take away from the so-called original foundation of socialist thought in labor movement. I have now 5 minutes. It's 8 p.m. sole time to end this talk and to wait for your comments and your reaction for the QA time. I would like to spend the last 5 minutes talking about the responses of the left today in front of the war that we have today, in front of the invasion of Russia in Ukraine. In my opinion, there are 3 responses that, each of them have as a different level. One response, and I found this particularly bizarre and sometimes hard to believe, that there are forces of the left who try to justify or hide or not take a very strong position, a clear, strong position against what Russia has done. In my opinion, this position is weak because it seems that these forces have problems to identify more than one enemies. There is not only NATO, not only the imperialist policies of United States, but there are more, including what could be discussed about China. And the other important thing is that there might be a lack of credibility when in the future similar things like the one that Putin has done in Ukraine might be done by other powers. So this is one position, and a criticism to this position can be actually done by reading Lenin and by reading what Lenin wrote about self-determination, national self-determination. And there are very important documents, also key documents of the debate of labor movements that are there to be debated and discussed, and to return to them is very important. The second position, and this is also dramatically wrong and dangerous, is the position that forces not only in the Socialist International, but also what we call today the radical left in Europe, and not only, became sort of co-belligerent. So in the end, accepted and are supporting, the expansion of expenses for war, or even the open support to NATO, like the case of Finland, that is actually entering, they are officially asked for entering in the alliance in NATO with the government of center-left. And this reminds this union sacrée, this expression that was actually created in France in 1914 at the outbreak of World War I, where there was the call from the state to put together all the forces and to unite the country at the time of a war with the enemy outside. So this is terribly dangerous, because in the end, there will be no difference between Atlantism and pacifism. And actually, many people could consider leftist forces, radical forces, as just a variation, a gray variation of the policies that are done by conservatives and rightist parties. The final position is a position that I find useful and interesting, also in order to see the conflict in Russia and what to do in Ukraine and what to do today. That is a policy of non-alignment. That does not mean that you have to be in between the Russia and Ukraine. This has been clarified many, many times, and perhaps there will be more to talk about this in the debate. But this is perhaps the position most effective to end the war, which means that there should be no escalation, which means that, army should not be sent to Ukraine in the way that the United States is doing in the past days particularly, and there should be the possibility and the need to call for, a diplomatic initiative, a dramatic, a strong diplomatic initiative that, in the end should give to Ukraine the status of course, an independent nation, but also not belligerent and not included in NATO. And in order to do this, I would like to finish my talk with a quotation written by Karl Marx in the 1850s, when he was talking about another war that took place in that region in Crimea. And Marx was, of course, criticizing Russia. I mentioned this at the beginning. He was saying that actually Russia today seems very similar to the beginning of this autocracy of the past of Ivan III. But Marx is also posing to those people in the democratic movement that are looking at this anti-Russian coalition with too much enthusiasm. And the quotation of Marx is the following: "It is a mistake to describe the war against Russia as a war between liberty and despotism, apart from the fact that if such be the case, liberty will be for the nuns represented by Bonaparte. The whole avowed object of the war is the maintenance of the Vienna treaties, those very treaties which annul the liberty and independence of nation." I think this is a juicy quotation, if you pass me the expression, because if we replace Bonaparte with United States of America and the Vienna treaties with NATO, this observation seems to be written by today. To conclude, and I'm already 3 minutes out of my time, my apologies, I believe that the left cannot consider, like in the famous von Clausewitz maxim, war as the continuation of politics by other means. In reality, war certifies the failure of politics. And if the left want to return to become hegemonic, I believe that, like Rosa Luxemburg taught us more than a century ago, we should write on our banners the words anti-militarism and no to war. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for your presentation, Professor Musto. Professor Musto has historically looked at how Marxist or left-wing traditions thought of war and has given timely implication for how to view Russia's invasion of Ukraine today. It is particularly true of the historical debate: should the defensive war be waged against militaristic Germany in the face of World War I, or will both sides of the war only reinforce the subordination of the working class? Or during World War II and the Cold War, should the protection of the Soviet Union as a core state of the revolution be the first goal, or this such action would only weaken the cause of socialism? Such debates remind me of our obligation to oppose any form of warfare which creates a powerful sphere that suppresses all individual liberties and incorporates them into the state apparatus. So, anyone who has any question or discussion on the presentation, please raise your hand or let me know by chat.
Thank you, and also thank you very much to Minzy, I believe it was her, because she shared in the chat the Korean translation of this article that is actually, I don't know if already published, but forthcoming very soon in print in the next issue of Marxism 21, right? It's in the chat.
Yeah. Yes, right. 네, 한상원 선생님.
Hi. Thank you very much for your talk, Professor Marcello Musto. My name is Sang Han, and I am also a co-researcher in this SSK team. I have just read your article, which is translated in Korean, which Minji shared, and I think this article is very interesting and helpful. And I have two questions about your lecture and your article. First question is, I guess you introduced many positions of Marxist positions of war, and I guess you are Marcello. You are more friendly to Rosa Luxemburg rather than Lenin. So am I? So you know that Lenin, in his book Socialism and War, Lenin criticized Luxemburg's position harsh. So Lenin had a theory of just war theory, but Luxemburg seems that she was against all kinds of even a war of self-determination, war for self-determination. But I guess you are more friendly. Your position is more friendly to Rosa Luxemburg. So maybe I am wrong. So this is the first question. And second is about the Ukrainian war. And I agree with you in principle. I agree with you. Firstly, we have to blame Putin's invasion. And secondly, but we have also we have to avoid escalation, and we must not support the USA or NATO or this imperialist organization. So I agree with this position. I agree with you in principle, but in concretely, frankly speaking, I am confused because the Ukrainian left activists, all of them, with whom I saw, they asked for more weapon, because they have no choice but to fight. They have no choice but to resist against invasion. We saw Bucha. In Bucha, there were mass murder against civilians, and this war is to Ukrainian people. This war does not only mean the geopolitical conflict between hegemonial powers, but it is also an attack to their own democracy, which they achieved by their own demonstrations against Yanukovych regime. It was a democracy from below, and Putin is now destroying this kind of democracy, and civilians are murdered, and women are raped. So they have no choice but to resist. So they left activists in Ukraine say they need more weapons. But I know that weapon delivery is dangerous. It can escalate the situation. So I'm actually speaking, I am very confused, and I think if Western leftists, I think there are conflict between Ukrainian left and Western left groups. So how can we make a balance between this dilemma situation? So I want to hear your position, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Excellent questions, both of them. Can I just answer to all the questions together? So let's see who else is there, and and I will then take all of them. Otherwise, I will speak too much. So next one. Thank you very much, Sang-Won Han.
Okay. Any more questions? I have a question. Today's Russian invasion of Ukraine is reminiscent of Marxist days, Russia's invasion of Poland and the Polish liberation movement. At the time, Marx expressed that the attitude of the left toward Poland would become the touchstone for their correctness, and that Poland was the external thermometer of the revolution. Although there were protagonists within the First International who refused to intervene in the Polish movement, the general atmosphere of the European left at the time was in favor of Poland. If there is a difference between Poland of the past and Ukraine of today, I think that in the case of Poles, for their liberation, they had to deeply intervene themselves in the great leftist movement of the time, such as the European Revolution of 1848. And this made Poland's national liberation movement not merely national self-determination, but a cosmopolitan human liberation movement. However, in today's Ukraine, it seems difficult to find any other alternative between NATO, centered on the United States, and the Russia, driven by a pan-Slavic ideology and interest. Today, it seems that there is a little chance for the left to claim anti-war and at the same time form a revolutionary moment. Which point could be the start point for the left? That's my question.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? So do you want me to, oh, there is Minzy, please.
Thank you for your talk. It was an interesting talk, especially about rising of feminism and reconstruction of socialist movement. I think your opinion against war means not pacifism, but analyze it. I ask you for an opinion about more explanation about labor movement and everyday life, which often called American hegemony. What do you think about the relationship between war and labor movement? I think war not only makes socialism collapse, but also make capable subjectivity proletariat, especially women labor in America and Munitones industry. I would like to know about your opinion.
Thank you. Anybody else? I'll ask the chair, should I go with this or there is more? Do you want me to answer to this?
Yes, please.
Thank you. So very interesting questions, and I will try to address all of them. In particular, the ones that are related to the topic, to the talk that I gave, because actually to speak about more contemporary issues, I will have, I will need more time to present more argument, particularly about this, the escalation, diplomatic effort, etc. While on the contrary, my paper was more historical. But of course, I understand your inquietudes and why you're asking about this. Anyway, let's try to do the best that I can with the limited time that we have. So Sangwon Han asked me about Luxembourg and Lenin. Well, actually, if I can make a joke about myself, this is the most Leninist paper that I have ever written, because actually I am praising a lot of what Lenin has done in terms of giving attention to the global South, understanding imperialism, and being able to connect also the cause for national self-determination, which is something that I use, categories that I use also to explain the present today. For example, my critique to one position of the left, one of the three positions. I use Lenin to do this, and it's fun because some of these components are more, at least in the way they present themselves, more orthodox Marxism, right? But they don't know that Lenin was determinant in order to understand the self-determination. And actually, if you remember, it was Putin himself who attacked Lenin just before the war, mentioning that it was because of Lenin that Ukrainian people believe that they have a national identity, because it was Lenin to give the concession of this to them. And I have a quotation in the paper that is also interesting, because I found something about Ukraine in a text written by Lenin in 1916 called Results of the Discussion on Self-Determination. Lenin wrote, "If the socialist revolution were to be victorious in Petrograd, Berlin, Warsaw, the Polish socialist movement, like the Russian or the German socialist government, they will renounce the forcible retention of Ukrainian with the frontiers of the Polish state." So Lenin is clearly saying that when socialism will win in each of this country, there will be more self-determination, there should be more democracy, and there should be more freedom and liberty. So good, and yes to Lenin from this point of view. Secondly, I always treated in this paper, because I only had 8,000 words, the length for a journal article, to analyze the main camps and the main position. I have treated Lenin and Luxembourg as what they were, allies, and not in opposition to each other. Because actually, for example, in this resolution of the Second International, Lenin, Luxembourg, and Martov are writing an important part of the resolution against militarism. So they surely, as you know very well, belongs to the same camp. Against war, against social chauvinism, if we want to use this Leninist adjective of the time, etc. But of course, they have differences. And my commentator, Sangwon Han, was smart and brilliant to see in the text something that I was not focusing on, but surely to see this rejection to all kinds of war that, in my point of view, is done from our contemporary perspective. So that's the point that I want to make. In my opinion, today, after Hiroshima, Nagasaki, with armies raised that we have everywhere, etc., a position like this one, an idea like this one, rethinking this question of war as an opportunity for revolution, it is something that is more useful for innovation of Marxism, rethinking alternatives, and the things that you do. And actually, in the text, I'm also citing Kautsky, but I could have cited many other people who, in a book, The Social Revolution, published in 1902, already then said, well, revolution will, in case of war, citation, be heavily loaded with tasks that are not essential. So if there is a war and then we win the revolution, then after this, the revolution will be in a complicated position because you have to rebuild the country, take away nationalist ideology, etc., etc. So that's my response, and I think it was clear, and I'm very grateful for this question. Now, the second question about Ukraine. I would like to make a clarification, even though I'm not a specialist in the field. But if we talk about the Ukrainian left, well, we should remind to ourselves that the Ukrainian left has been forbidden. So these are forbidden organizations because this government has criminalized communism, socialism, etc. So I think that you might want to adjust that statement a little bit more because, you go to prison, you were to prison, or you were attacked by, the groups that very conservative, if not openly fascist, that exist in Russia, in Ukraine, or also if they were not organizations of the left, very, very weak. But, these groups, people coming with a stronger connection with Russia, speaking Russian languages, all the things that we know. So they're asking for more weapons, and we have to talk about something that is less theoretical and that is concrete. I apologize, we all do from home, and sometimes there are telephones, etc. So more weapons means, in my opinion, more losses for Ukraine too. I mean, this too, like this might be an ideal scenario for United States, as it has been said by many people, Chomsky and many others, because they will just arm a population to do a war that they want to do to make Russia weaker and to create economics problems in Europe and to make Europe closer and tied to United States. So I see what you say, and I ask this to myself every day since the beginning of war, and I agree with you, with the exception of this clarification of what the present government has done to leftist forces, progressive forces, etc. But I still believe that the key point for us is negotiation, and to go there as soon as possible. And if there are these ideas that, like the government, Zelensky, etc., is saying that they win the war or that they will receive this incredible amount of money, ammunitions, etc., that later we have to see what is happening with this. And we can compare history in the past and see what happened in other countries that received this and what happened to this. And I will return to this in connection with what Minzy asked me in the end. Well, then you understand why my position is, first of all, try to understand what is the key elements, what are the key elements to go to negotiation, which does not mean that we live in an abstract war and therefore we should ignore the concrete things and the concrete and legitimate demands of Ukrainian population to defend themselves. Now, the question is also done by this question by Guhyeon Jeong from another perspective, from a historical perspective, with the case of Poland, very interesting. And you said, Poland was the meter for revolution in Europe, if I understand correctly. Yes, it was Marx himself who wrote about this, because if Poland is getting independence or is close to independence, as I also try to argue in my paper, it means that the counter-revolutionary power of Russia is weaker. So if Poland is strong and independent, and that's why you also said that is, if I understand again correctly, that is something that is good for Europe in general. Well, the difference is that that movement was a more progressive movement. It was a movement that was then with the articulation, Sang-Won Han knows, and this is also a debate between Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin, independence, not independence, self-determination or not. I have lost, okay, now the connection is back. Lenin was in favor. Luxembourg was skeptical because, you know, this will create this conflict among workers and this sense of, you know, chauvinism, etc. But in terms of today's Ukraine, I don't think there are conditions anywhere to see revolutionary movements, etc., in particular in Ukraine. So we have to focus on the other element of your question and of your final statement of today's Ukraine, that is peace. And we have to try to see what is possible to bring peace back in this region as soon as possible, and without, you know, imagining, you know, progressive forces that today don't exist in Ukraine, but, you know, giving the legitimate right to people there to defend themselves and to see this war, this aggression to end as soon as possible. The last question, very short, if I have understood it correctly, but very important, very relevant, is about the effect of war on subjectivity, right? Means, do I get it right? So what happens to workers, to working class, to a population, to a country, to a civil society when there is the war? And I couldn't deal with this in my paper as much as I would have liked. But you see, and the first person who asked me the question, colleague Sang-Won Han, saw this in my paper, like, you know, the idea of the importance of diminishing as much as possible the power to military, the power to the oppressive apparatus, etc. And I write as much as I can in the final part of the paper the essential elements of opposing to nationalism, the essential elements that the left should always take and never forget, that war in the end, you know, bring back the social conditions to do the revolution if you want, or simply to improve the social relations in a country, because they create this spiral of violence, of nationalism, of competition, and or, for example, of destructions of the means of production, development, etc., that will bring the social condition of that country back. It is for that reason, going back to the first question, that there should be a way for the left, and this has been done by several political forces and also theorists and intellectuals, to bring not only peace, but anti-militarism. That was a very strong category that belonged to the left, but it disappeared from the political debate and the political vocabulary, to bring these two elements at the center, at the core of a new alternative and feasible policy for radical left parties and organizations.
Okay. Is there any more question? No? I think it's time to finish our talk. Do you want to make a closing comment, Professor Musto?
Just thank you very much for the, you know, stimulating question and comments. And I want to congratulate with you, because also in this new series of talks, you are producing something that it is available for all of us. It's in the internet, on YouTube. I'm trying to circulate this as much as possible. And I'm looking forward for these contributions to also become parts of collective volumes, and then later, you know, international contributions that are coming from Korea and from all the people like me, all the scholars, activists like me, who have been collaborating with Professor Jeong and with your units for many times, and very much admire the work that you do, and are particularly happy nowadays, glad to see a new generation of scholars, of activists who are, continuing the task that, Professor Jeong has started long time ago. And I say Jeong, I also mean all the people who have been working with him and the journal Marxist 21. And it is always my pleasure to collaborate with you. I'm glad that the Marx Revival is out, and I'm looking forward to return to Korea in person as soon as the international condition will allow me. So this is a thank you, but it's a goodbye to very, very soon.
Thank you. Thank you for your great presentation and time, Professor Musto, and thank you all. I hope to see you all at celebration party for the publication of Marx의 부활 to be held in Korea soon. We will let you know. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.